Hello, I'm Judith Panera, Executive Director of ANC and AMC Foundation. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Thank you for joining us. Our offices are located in New York, and today I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn, location situated upon the unceded seized territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples, and benefited from the economies of slavery and the labors of African-descended captives. We owe our existence and vitality to generations from around the world who were brought here against their will, drawn here to escape persecution, and some that have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. We pay respect to their communities past and present. This acknowledgement asks us each to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. AMC is dedicated to an environment in which all individuals are treated with respect and dignity at our programs. Each individual has the right to be in a professional atmosphere that prohibits discriminatory practices, including harassment. Our full code of conduct policy for today's program and all our programs, events, and overall work, as well as the outlets to make a direct or anonymous report of a violation, has been posted in our chat feature. We are grateful to our attendees for making space in their schedule to join us. I also want to acknowledge and welcome all our members here today and express our gratitude to them for being part of our community. We give thanks to our speakers for sharing their experiences and knowledge in today's candid and open forum. Please also be sure to check out our YouTube channel to see recordings of past programs as well. Thank you again for joining us. And now to begin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Ilaria Conti. I'm going to be the moderator of today's program. I would like to start by thanking Judith, Emma, and everybody at AMC for organizing and hosting this event. It is truly very nice to be here today and have the chance to have this conversation with Lisa Rapna and Pablo, who are with us today. I encourage them to turn on their cameras, and I would like to also thank them for accepting this invitation, for being here. The idea of this conversation emerged really from an interest in continuing to deepen conversations around whether present-day museums, institutions at large, are epistemically, ethically, and infrastructurally equipped to welcome and host, take care of, support, and much more, I would say, Indigenous artistic practices. And one of the hopes behind this conversation was to address this topic, also thinking about the context of AMC internationally, but also within the United States, and really invite curatorial practices that work with different epistemic contexts to look at some of the big picture aspects, and also to look at some more focused or practical, perhaps I should say, questions to really continue to pursue an effort to amplify further the conversations between different curatorial locales. So I will now briefly introduce our guest speakers, and then we can dive right into the conversation, which will last approximately 45 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A. In the meantime, I encourage those who are joining today to type their questions in the Q&A section as these come to mind, and not wait until the end, and we will address them, as I said, toward the end of the conversation. So to get started with introductions, Lisa Rapna Finnbok is a Sami Indigenous scholar, doyer, and curator from Oslo, Vapste, and Skanit in the Norwegian part of Sápmi. She's currently based in Tampere on the Finnish side of Sápmi, where she's doing postdoc research in connection with mediated Arctic geographies, which is a project that aims to look at how Arctic geospheres are aesthetically shaped and mediated to become vehicles of environmental, geopolitical, and social concerns. And her specific focus is on the relation between indigenous aesthetics in the Arctic and land. And Paulo José Ramirez is a curator and author based in Berlin. He was the inaugural adjunct curator of First Nations and Indigenous art at Tate Modern from 2019 up until recently in 2023. His work explores non-Western ontologies, brown and Indigenous histories, and the aesthetic possibilities of non-colonial materialities. He's also the co-curator with Diana Nawi of the Hammer Museum Biennial Made in LA 2023. So thank you to both of you again for being here and for being open to this conversation. I would like to start, again, as I said, with some, let's say, big picture item. I would really like to start by asking about your relationship with the term curator. I think it's an important starting point for this to contextualize even further. So I would like to ask whether you could share with us a little bit your relationship with this term, curator, and also with notions of curating or of the curatorial, especially when in relation to Indigenous practices. And I was interested in learning more about how you understand this notion, how you address it, or perhaps even reshape it or contest it somehow. So we could get started from here somehow with the curatorial as a starting point. I don't know whether any of you would like to go first.
Lisa, if you want to go first, please.
I can go first. Okay. So first of all, I think that even if I have done or I've had positions where I do curatorial practice, even if I have been designated a curator at certain times, I don't perhaps always recognize myself as being one. And that comes mainly from the fact that I strongly feel that both the art world, the global art world in general, and as an extension of that, also the term curator is very colonial. That is to say, these are fields and concepts that have been developed within a very colonial structure. And so there isn't really an understanding that resonates with the philosophies that grows from Indigenous ways of being, what you might term ontology, of knowing, which is epistemology, or of doing, which is, axiology. So actually, in many cases, I strongly feel that the term curator and the understanding of that practice very often limits the practice that is really called upon from an Indigenous person going in to connect with and work with Indigenous art. So for me, I don't know if there is a specific term that I would employ, but I do think that if we look at some of the ways of conceptualizing the practice behind what it is an Indigenous person being asked to come in and curate does, I think we need to touch upon under like terms such as guardian, caretaker, defender, because we have to keep in mind that very often the Indigenous art that is looked to in general from these many institutions of art and museum and galleries is art that essentially takes what is some of the deepest traumatic experiences of the artists, and when that art is then displayed, it is in essence, or it is in practice, an act of re-traumatizing. And so that means that as a curator in this context, you have a deeper responsibility than what might be associated with the role of curator in a traditional understanding of the term. I think I'll stop it there and leave it to Pablo, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. I agree with you, Lisa. I think that the term curator, as you know, like as an art professional, especially, it's quite embedded into institutional infrastructures, and it does has a a history that is also quite recent, right? So it's quite difficult to, to call oneself a curator and, while at the same time you try to struggle, or you have a practice that you believe is in part questioning these very structures, right? That on the first place legitimize the practice of a curator. I think that I will probably share a little bit of my own experience on how I came to
Let's see.
childhood in an Maya Quiche small town, and then I moved back to a city. My parents were both involved in the leftist movement against the military dictatorship. So I was involved more in activism, and I never studied art history or curatorial practice. I studied political science. And at some moment we were doing some kind of festivals and just activism. And I came to the practice of Regina Jose Galindo, which is this well-known performance artist from Guatemala. And well, time passed, and at some point I realized in the capital, but in a smaller city, that there was a huge a range of practices that didn't fit into what usually museums would call contemporary art. And those practices were most of the time coming not from art schools, not from museums or art fairs, because, in the case of Guatemala, there are none, but they were coming from mostly smaller communities in the country, writers, theater practitioners, activists doing something that it was not quite activism, but some kind of rituality. And I just kind of fell for it. And I started working on this kind of in-between, where part of my job was trying to reconcile this set of practices that were not part of the establishment of contemporary art, on how we read, how we understand these practices as contemporary art as well. And then, I guess that in my case, the practice thinking as a curator or working as a curator was some kind of like a strategic decision at a time. And now, now it's too late. I am already on this, but I think that part of what we do is to probably try to challenge these kind of like fixed notions of curator and art professionals and so on. The other thing that I would say is that there is really, and this comes as a critique to I guess my own practice as well, and there is really little knowledge production within Curator. And in a kind of like a worrying way, like, like most of the times, and you read curatorial text, wall text, and there is some kind of like, almost kind of mimesis, some kind of like repetition of concepts that work somehow in a almost kind of algorithmic way, in the sense that curators are not producing knowledge at this point. It's people in the field, in the communities, think. And I say that this is worrying, because if we work with practices such as indigenous art, for instance, we do need to engage with forms of knowledge, and I don't see where that is happening at this moment. And this is where probably something that Ilaria, you mentioned at some point, that is, we need to think about the division between curatorial practice and the curatorial as some kind of epistemic field where we can actually think of and ask these difficult questions.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'll definitely jump on that last point to sort of connect to the next question. And also, I just want to flag Pablo, Lisa, Ravna, please also, like, besides the order of the questions, but comments or afterthoughts, or we don't need to necessarily stick to a rigid structure at all. But I think continuing on what you just mentioned, Pablo, my next question was really about issues of epistemic translation. And this is something that we discussed while we were preparing for this talk, because what I've observed many times is that when entering somehow the space of the institution, Indigenous artists and practices often have to be in translation, so to say, and adapt to the epistemic language of the institution. And I mean this both linguistically, but also very much metaphorically, right? So, and this dynamic sometimes seems quite inescapable. It's present many times. And this is, this I think acquires also a deeper sort of meaning, but also it has a more serious implication, considering precisely what you, Lisa Ravna, were mentioning, sort of the epistemic genealogy of institutions, right? To use the general terms, institutions, museums, when considering that the epistemic genealogy of museums, as we know them in general, is a Western one. So I wanted to ask your thoughts on this, and also perhaps whether there are some strategies or processes that you think can be useful when thinking about how this epistemic power relation can be somehow subverted, right? So just to kind of simplify the question, if we see that Indigenous practices and artists often have to stretch, right, toward institutions, always be in epistemic translation, what are some possible methods or some of your thoughts around this to instead revert this power relation, have the institution somewhat have this, make this stretch, this outreach toward artists?
Well, I think that quite often one of the issues, and this is similar both, you know, in the art scene, if we are talking about curatorial practices, but also within academia and like scholarly disciplines and engagements, because quite often it seems to me that someone has an idea that they want to do a project and that they want to include Indigenous methodologies, Indigenous knowledge, but only later, after the project has been developed, do they actually include Indigenous people to come in and work it in practice? What that means is that the basic fundament of that project will very likely be more aligned with, if we call it Western epistemologies, than it would be Indigenous epistemologies. And so if you look at the fundamental difference between what a Western and an Indigenous epistemology or methodology for that matter would be, and now I'm speaking very like broadly, this is very broadly speaking, but whereas in the West, the idea of knowledge is very much connected to the individual. So there you have the individual scholar, the individual curator, the individual artist that kind of develops and pushes the creation of knowledge. If you move within an Indigenous setting, knowledge is collective. So that means that you recognize that whenever knowledge is created, developed, and pushed, that is a collective effort. Even if you as a curator, as an individual curator, is invited into a project and you kind of design the methodology of an exhibition, the knowledge that you bring into that project is born from your relations and interactions with community, with art, with artists, with other people. And so I think this is one of the things that I often struggle with, is that if you have already established an individual fundament for the project, it doesn't matter how many Indigenous people you invite in, because the basis is already inherently biased So I think more and more what we need to see happen is that Indigenous people are actually those brought in to develop the project. Not simply, we want to celebrate indigeneity in this exhibition, or we want to celebrate the culture of Indigenous people. So we need Indigenous people to come and be visible doing precisely that. No, you actually need to change the very way that you think, in that if you hold the authority, then you invite people in and say, do what you want, and then you take a step back. Now, I don't think we see that happen often enough. And again, this connects with the idea of the individual and the importance of the individual, because it's very difficult for people to then step back and see others take the glory. But it's not about that, because if you as an individual, if you hold a position as either a curator or a director or a scholar, and you have the opportunity to invite marginalized groups and people in, then by taking that step back, you are an extremely important part of the process, and that will generate back to you. So that I really think we need to see that shift happen. And having said that, because it's not as if every Indigenous person is born having all of this knowledge that you can immediately articulate. That requires hard and persistent work. And it's often much more harder because we are also struggling with epistemicide, so the colonial act of killing knowledge. What that means is that when we are creating our knowledge, if we do not have the support system, if we do not have the funding and the opportunity to actually push that, then we don't really reach the point that we need to be in order to really begin thinking about, decolonizing the structures of these very colonial institutions. So, for instance, when I was working, when we were curating the Nordic Pavilion during last year's Biennale, one of the things that I really appreciated about that project was the funding for me to actually sit down and really think about what is the methodology that we are implementing here. So I had time and money to just sit and think through the practices of my people, trying to theorize them, articulate them in a way that made sense and that could be understood not only across communities into the settler society, but also amongst the communities of Indigenous people. And I think that is so extremely rare. We rarely have that opportunity. And what you were saying earlier, Pablo, about how a curator doesn't really produce knowledge, this is what you need to do with your curatorial practice. If not if not you individually, then you better create opportunities and possibilities for people to come and actually do that knowledge production. And that's not happening enough today, I'm sorry to say. Yeah, I'm gonna hand it over to Pablo.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to put it. I'm thinking on the Sami Pavilion, as you mentioned, and I had the chance to visit the Biennale, and of course spend time with the Sami Pavilion, and I think that what this is practice, I mean, I know about like its development and also, by learning with you and by spending some time with the artists there, something that happens in these practices as curatorial projects is that they are presenting us a different form of understanding our contemporaneity. In the sense that, like, I think that going back to the idea of translation that you mentioned, Ilaria, the question is not how we include Indigenous art practices into the canon of the contemporary, but the question is how indigenous art practices are questioning the universalizing aims of the canon of the contemporary. So in that way, it's kind of like a move against, right? You are, you know, you are destabilizing, you know, the canon of the contemporary. And this can only happen by engaging in projects that are, you know, proposing new ways of doing. So again, it's not just about bringing objects to an exhibition. It's about kind of rethinking our ways, or a different ethos of making exhibitions. And I think that is quite clear with the Sami Pavilion. It's very, in some cases within museum practice, or even like large biennales, it's a very hard thing to do, because you have, because of how the machine, how kind of like the machine operates, right? You have people invited to do biennales or to curate shows. Sometimes these people, well, everyone has different affiliations, but at this point, having indigenous artists at a show, it feels like a must for many curators, right? So it's a matter of inclusion, you know, of quotas. And that's something that we see very, very clearly in how the, you know, the art infrastructure works in places like the US, for instance, right? Like museums ask these questions like, as you know, like, okay, so how many of this, how many brown artists, how many indigenous artists? And the problem with this is that we still thinking in terms of like diversity and inclusion, and that is not enough to actually question the contemporary as a universalizing canon. So I will go to this thinking on translation. Ilaria, I think that I don't think translation is a bad thing as such. I think that everyone somehow is engaging in you know systems of translation all the time. We travel, we speak to people that speak different languages. We're using English here because is what we need to do. But I think that the question is how translation operates as power. You know, like what kind of languages have hegemony over others, and you know, like how is that we are understanding translation in terms of like, it's not the same when, you know, I speak with a group of people and we gather together in some kind of commonality, even when they belong to different cultures, different languages, than when a museum or a biennale is inviting a group of artists to present work. It's different things happen there. So I think that when speaking about translation, we need to somehow kind of like find these nuances and probably, yeah, kind of go from there.
Thank you for this, Pablo. Yes, definitely. And I also think when thinking about this notion of translation more metaphorically, really a question is how can certain practices exist within the infrastructure, epistemic infrastructure of the institution of that has a Western genealogy. And we will get to it also in a little bit when thinking not only about exhibition practices, but also collecting practices. So when some of these practices are being formalized somewhat in object and into objects and then become somehow, let's say, property of the museum. But it's very complex, but we'll get to it. I included a question around this precisely because of the level of nuances that needs to be articulated. And so talking about language and translation, however, also from a more sort of first level standpoint, another thing that I wanted to try and focus on and ask you about is really how to develop curatorial work and work with Indigenous artistic practices without, sort of while at the same time avoiding explanatory logics and the dangers that explanatory logics sort of carry within themselves, right? I think, for instance, about institutional tendencies to simplify, over-explain, and overall really control through various means, not just a wall text or a wall label, but again, over-explain in a broader sense of the word. And when thinking about this particular question, a couple of things from your respective practices came to mind. In your case, Lisa Ravna, I was thinking about how explicit you have been when addressing, for instance, certain Sami aspects that are not to be disclosed or mentioned or explained. And I think about, for instance, spiritual components, right? So I was thinking about this, but I was also thinking about how in the past, you've raised also the question when discussing, for instance, the plurality of meanings. You've raised the fact that something can have multiple meanings, cannot be reduced to one single explanation or definition, and how these multiple meanings cannot be divided from contextual specificity. So also when presenting practices in other contexts, how to work around those complexities. And so I am known, as I told you before, for asking very long questions. So this was somewhat the question, but when thinking about this explanatory logic and its dangers in relation to Lisa Daphna's practice, but Pablo, you also have addressed this question, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. And given that you've brought it up already, I would also like to ask you in relation to this, also your thoughts on this issue of diversity. You've just mentioned it, but I think that especially because of the discourse, how prominent this discourse is in European and North American context, it would be great to also delve further into your thoughts around that when thinking about sort of the explanatory somehow.
Well, what strikes me is that picking up on what Pablo was saying about diversity and inclusion, when you talk about diversity and inclusion, what you're really doing is maintaining the center, or you're maintaining the normative, because you're then creating a language and a practice that is somehow supposed to allow more, like broadening the scope while still maintaining that center. And I think that very much also relates to what is very important for me, this issue of respecting and understanding that sometimes things are not to be known by a broader public. So, and that is also like, it's not as if I'm saying that only Sami people or only certain indigenous cultures are allowed to know this kind of knowledge. It's something that even within my communities, there is specific specialized knowledge that is sort of connected with special functions, specific practices. So, and see, the problem is that quite often we see that indigenous cultures are very often homogenized in the sense that they are kind of likened, like they're presented as very one-dimensional. And the fact is that the world is not one-dimensional. We're always engaged and complexified through multifaceted ways of exploring, engaging, and so on. And so for me, what's very important in my practice is to allow room for that. Because I think by doing that, there is also an element of, you're also being humble in a way, not always pushing yourself forward as being the authority or the voice that is allowed to speak on behalf of, because there are often times that I've been asked to talk about specific topics, and I'm like, but I can't really do that. I'm not comfortable doing that because I don't know enough about it. So you should really talk to this and that person, because I think what's often forgotten within the global modern world is that epistemologies is not something that is the prerogative of the Western world. We do have our own epistemologies, meaning that we have our own ways of training academics, practitioners that delve into knowledge systems. These practitioners are quite often marginalized or erased in the search for knowledge if you do that search from a Western center. And I think this is where you can really engage and make use of your own privileges, especially if you are within a position as a curator and you do have that privilege to actually think about, but what is the practices, what is the knowledge practices, the systems of knowledge, the epistemologies in the community that I am now working with and trying to bring into the institution. I'm not sure if that is a good answer to the question, but I just Indigenous people have, for a very long time, in general, this is the truth for marginalized groups, that for a very long time, there has been this notion of ownership, in the sense that the normative feels that they hold the right of definition, of dissemination, meaning that some of the things that have been kept hidden, secret within the indigenous cultures is truly connected to the desire to survive on your own terms. And because we can't begin to talk about equality in the world, we can't really say that an indigenous person is equal to a non-indigenous person, or even a person of color being equal to a white person. I mean, white privilege is a thing, it exists. And so sometimes we keep hold of that, that strengthens our culture and our way of life, because if we give it away, it gets taken and used without consideration for the place where it come from, or came from. And so I try to be very aware of that, very, very problematic dynamic when I work within both indigenous and non-indigenous institutions, but also work with both indigenous and non-indigenous artists, because we're all allowed to keep parts of ourselves to ourselves. So just because you're indigenous doesn't mean that you need to perform that indigeneity at all times. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and I would be interested in also hearing from you, Lisa, about how we can engage with with these non-discursive places, like how we can engage with, or if we should, right, like as exhibition makers or writers, with places of knowledge that are probably kept for the community, how to create that bridge. It's I think that is a good question for curatorial practice and for writing as well, for research, right? And this makes me think on like how within exhibition making, and let's say like art history, probably the idea of like diversity and kind of like the contemporary has, how it came to happen, right? And I think that it's useful to probably for people to remember that, maybe 20, 30 years ago, things were quite differently when it came to art and art history. Like if we look at the 80s and 90s, the 90s had this huge explosion of biennales, like, every major city wanted to have a biennale. Museums started to decentralize their collections. So they started hiring, curators from different parts of the world, consultants, and in the case of the so-called global museums, like Tate or MoMA, started like also to have regional committees of acquisition. So that's how, many major collections started to have like specialized areas on African art, Latin American art, and so on. And always these categories were kind of overimposing over others. A new category emerged, and out of that, like, there is a set of questions that we cannot answer, right? Like, why Latin American art? What is that we are obliterating, for instance, when we speak about Latin American art? So I'm saying this because I think that the moment that we are in, quite like hand in hand with the politics of neoliberal multiculturalism, it's what actually moves in a way the forces of museums and big biennales to this date. So we can speak about diversity in this way, and we, like, many institutions are eager to speak about indigenous art because it's part of the logic of neoliberal multiculturalism. It's the conceptual apparatus of neoliberal multiculturalism needs of these categories, and that's quite tricky, and it relates to what Lisa was mentioning. It's precisely there where I think that it's important to think on places that are not translatable, to think on engaging with practices that are not for everyone, that are not meant to be there at the show, at the exhibition. And I think that art and art practice and the art object does a pretty good work at this, and artists do know this game quite well. They know how to, be in a show, but also there is so much about these objects, whatever their practices, that, people just cannot grasp. But not for that, the object is not powerful as an art object itself. And that's what makes like the practice of indigenous art so powerful. And also so, I would say, transnational and cosmopolitan, right? Like the possibility of Nahua artist from Mexico having a work in Korea and still, being a piece of art. It's precisely that. And that happens with art, not nowhere else, but in art. Yeah.
Thank you for this. So I still have a couple of questions that I want to share, but I want to pose this as the next one because I think it goes straight to some of the elements that really I have encountered when learning more about your respective practices. And Lisa Ravna, in your case, in our conversation, you mentioned two elements that I think I wanted to ask you more about, if you feel like sharing it. And particularly, these are the notion of relational accountability, and you touched upon that a little bit. But when thinking about this in relation to curatorial practice, another element that you've sort of mentioned, articulated in the past, is the subjective will of all things. And so these are two very complex elements to integrate when thinking about curatorial practice. And so I would like to ask you about that. And Pablo, since you were sort of talking about cosmopolitanism, again, similarly, there are some elements that I found as recurring, also conceptual tools, maybe in your practice. And the first is precisely this idea of indigenous cosmopolitanism, which I've heard you articulate elsewhere, but also that of vibrational silence, which I really was struck by. And so I thought it would be wonderful if you wanted to sort of comment or unpack a little bit these notions.
Should I just
go ahead? Sure, of course. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, relational accountability. So relational accountability is in many ways similar to what in the West would perhaps be like the concept of, like Haraway's concept of situated knowledges, in the sense that when you do your work, you are responsible of making visible the relations you have. So to community, to land, to knowledge practices, to spirits, to essentially to everything that surrounds you and that follows you on your everyday, like in your everyday life, and also follows you into your practice as well, whatever it is. If you curatorial practice or any other form of practice. And I think one of the things about that, and it kind of reminds me of this experience I had as when I was still doing my PhD. where I was very much engaged in the practice of storytelling, which in a Sami context is a way, it is an epistemology. So stories, the Sami word for story is moitalos. And moitalos shares the same root with the verb moitit, which means to remember. So in a Sami ontological context, to tell a story is also to remember something that has happened, something that is real, that is factual. And so that also means that people are invested in the stories that they are telling, and that you as a scholar are collecting for your research. And so this was a PhD course on methodology, and I was trying to develop my Sami methodology, specifically in the shape of storytelling. And I presented a paper at that PhD course where I said that when you receive a story, you do not own that story. That story still belongs to the community that shared it with you. The very next day, the keynote speaker on interviews as a method of empirical research took parts of that paper that I presented and put it up on the screen and said, "This is wrong. This is not how you do research. If this is how you are working as a scholar, then you don't understand what it is to be a scholar." That experience was interestingly enough, I myself at that time didn't really react in any way to it. I was just a little bit, why are you sort of putting up my work there and talking about it in a bad way? Now, my peers, the other PhD students at that course, they were so angry on my behalf and came to me afterwards, and this is absolutely not acceptable. The keynote speaker, a white person, non-Indigenous, in a position of power, had decided to use that power to ridicule the knowledge, the ways of knowledge and the ways of, or the practices of knowledge transference and keeping that I had been born and raised with. And I think that, for me, is the point of relational accountability. That you understand that every choice you make as a person, as an individual, will always impact everyone else in your life. So whenever you are making a choice, it's not a choice that only affects you as an individual. It has an impact on everything around you. And this brings us then to the concept of subjective will, because in a Sami philosophy, we don't really believe that things have a soul in the sense that we understand soul in a Western context. What we do believe, however, is that animals, lands, waters, the trees, the wind, the sun are entities in their own right. And as entities, they do have a subjective will. The river will run in a certain way. If you try to change the way the river runs, it will always try to go back to its original path, because that is the will of the river. Or grass, if you don't cut it, it will try to grow and expand, because that is the will of the grass. By not in a Western context, so in the Western epistemology, and now we're talking about Descartes and the understanding of, the personhood of people being the most elevated ranking, if we can call it that, doesn't really recognize that things hold subjective will, and so they subjugate other entities. They subjugate the land. Capitalism is all about subjugating land, subjugating people, subjugating entities. So in my practice, I'm very aware that when I, in my curatorial practice, makes a choice for the artwork, for the artist, I am also directing my will upon that. And so if you are not aware then of the power that gives you, that you then leverage over these other entities, you know, we should all think about the privilege that we hold as people. We should all think about the power that we have as people. And we should also all think about, how do we use that privilege? How do we use that power? Are we using that power and privilege to step on other things and people? Are we using that power and privilege to expand our dominion over other things and beings and entities? And if the answer to that is yes, then I think you really need to consider the way that you live your life. And so that's what I am every day trying to do. And of course, I'm not, you know, it's not as if I woke up one day and this is, I know now how I'm supposed to live my life. I make mistakes all the time. We all do. But the point is not then to ignore that mistake. It is to recognize that mistake and do better next time, perhaps. So yeah, for me, that is the essence of relational accountability and subjective will.
Thank you for this. Paulo.
Yeah, indigenous cosmopolitanism and silence. Yeah, I don't know where to start, but I would say that I mean these are two ideas that I've been working on within practice, but also writing. It somehow has helped me to think on some forms of intersectionality, especially when thinking about, you know, indigeneity. When I first, for instance, came to work to Tate, one, you know, it was one of the main questions was like, you know, how we mark the boundaries, for instance, between what is indigenous art and what is not, and that's a major problem because it's you know, that precisely points to one of the limitations of institutions, of museums, right? Like institutions think on this way, right? Categories, what it is, what it is not, right? And how we can set a kind of like a sort of, you know, the script kind of like historical trajectory of indigenous art, which is also super difficult. So when and then another questions arise, for instance, that yeah, we cannot delve deep into that in this talk. One is you know, questions like even thinking simply from the experience of being a mestizo in Guatemala, you know, and by mestizo I mean in the context of Guatemala being literally a mix of indigenous cultures, Mayan mostly, 20 the Mayan region in Guatemala, and Spanish settlers. So mestizo, for instance, in a place like Guatemala means something very different than what it would mean in Canada, like a métis, right? That it's a mestizaje as well, but it hegemonizes in a different way. So these forms of, you know, let's say being indigenous in one place and or in other are put, well, that really complex, right? The other thing was that when thinking, and if that happens a lot in curatorial practice, when you see a text about a show about indigenous art or with indigenous artists included, most of the times these ways of writing are extremely, you know, ethnographic in a way. It's like the colonial language operates so deep into the way that we do writing in art. And that's because curators are most of the time taking the place of the observer, of the ethnographic observer. So, you would say, these artists that are, it's a Amazonian painter, Naobi, and it's, so curators start speaking about something that they don't really know. And it's always in this kind of descriptive way. This is what has always happened to indigenous communities around the world, right? Like, the sort of scientific kind of descriptive eye, some kind of panoptic, right? So the art world is not exempt of that. And it is quite current, like we see it everywhere. So one challenge was how we flip a little bit that game, and how is that we, but in terms of like its planetary belonging, it being indigenous is not being just from this or that community, but it means belonging to the planet, and that claim, that claim of some kind of a different universalism, as I see it, is important to think on an indigeneity that can be intersectional, and that kind of claim a belonging that is a belonging to a specific culture, but that is also a belonging to some kind of planetary consciousness that is there. The thing is that we cannot access to it, but that is there. So that is what I'm thinking when I speak about indigenous cosmopolitanism. And this is something that I see quite often in art, artists, of course, that are doing the exhibitions, traveling the world, but also that as we were talking, and as Lisa mentioned, their communities. That is something that happens within indigenous art practices. Like you do a biennale, but that you are accountable in your community, and that speaks to a form of cosmopolitanism. And then when thinking about silence, I mentioned this before, but it's the question on how we can engage. And I don't use the word speak or write, but I'm thinking with some kind of political residue, something that is kind of like stays out of the text. And by text, I mean any discursive form of explanation. And I think of vibrational silence because in this case, silence is not the absence of meaning. And we see that with many cultural practices. There is meaning there, but it is not translatable. We cannot put it into words, and it is not meant for everybody. And that form of vibration operates in art, but it operates in culture at large. And I think that one of the main questions when thinking about art and rituality and even like performance and so on is, can museums and can curators engage with this? And if we can, how? And this is a conversation that we still need to have, I think.
Thank you very much for this. So someone reminds me that we have 15 minutes left. I have 2 questions that I would like to quickly try to address, and then maybe we can take a couple of questions from those who are still with us. But so sort of thinking about all of this, I also wanted, as promised, to delve into a question regarding collections and the institutional practice of collecting, right? To ask whether it's conciliable somehow with the grounding elements that we've been discussing so far in relation to indigenous practices. Is it possible to collect? Is it possible to do so in a way that is regarded as ethical somehow or not? If so, yes, it's a very broad question. And again, we don't have much time, but I wanted at least to put it on the table because alongside exhibition practices is one of the other big, I would say, elephant in the rooms. So I'll pass it on to both of you.
I don't know. I don't really have any good answer to that question, I think, because I don't think it is a question that actually can be answered. I think that I think that the ontology behind the act of collecting is too colonial to actually at present time to actually talk about collecting being possible in a good way that adheres to the ways and practices of I don't know what to call it. Like, it's I have very serious issues with the act of collecting, the process of creating collection. I think much of that comes from, so there is this amazing British museologist, Eileen Hooper Greenhill, that very clearly states that actually the act of collecting is it is a way of expressing dominion, symbolic dominion. And I think for me, we have not yet reached a point where we can be comfortable with the act of collecting to the degree that we can, start to actually think about it in a positive sense. There needs to be more debate about it. Now, having said that, there are some examples of artists that, very clearly, for instance, Mara Anasara, who is a Sami artist, and so the biggest art gallery in Norway recently purchased her art, and she was very clear that yes, we can talk about it. Ended up just basically saying, if you buy my art, then it needs to be on display at all times. The second that you take down my work, you send it back to my community. Which was one way of basically like switching the power inherent in the act of collecting. So yeah, I don't know. Pablo, I know you have some experience with this, right?
Yeah, this example that you just gave, it's interesting, like how an artist also, I guess, can create some pressure. There is some negotiation that rarely happens when a museum is acquiring a work, like the rules are simple, like they just go and buy the work and then that's it, right? So I think that when it comes to indigenous art practices, there is much more going on there, and I don't have an answer. I don't know. Probably has been 10 years, but I think that there is one example that is quite probably speaks to this one, Lisa, is Edgar Calel. So Edgar Calel is a Tzutujil artist from the the Tzutujil region in Guatemala, in the Lago de Atitlán, and he has this work that has presented in different iterations with stones, and on top of the stones there is cut fruits and vegetables that works as an offer. So usually, you would see that quite often in different mountains and sacred places in Guatemala, like, just cut vegetables and fruit on top of stones. So the work was presented by Ultravioleta in a fair, but the work was not on sale. What was on sale was the drawings on the wall that were the representation of the stones, and the drawings were very beautiful. So in this case, we'd say there was the possibility of acquiring the work, but the problem was that it was not on sale. So after many talks with the artists and with people around Calel, we came to the agreement of having the work. So the custodianship is for 12 years. And the agreement was that after those 12 years, the work was going to be given back either to the community, to the earth, or passed to another institution that will have the work for another 12 years in consultation with the artist. And you know, this is really interesting because that doesn't mean that the whole game changed within collections, but it was just interesting because it was a huge glitch in how Tate was acquiring works. So one simple question was like, okay, so how we do the legal like agreement of this, you know, how a custodianship works. So we're not keeping the work forever, or like, okay, so can we use different stones, or are we just keeping these stones? You know, so I think that there are multiple examples, as you said, of practices that pushes the boundaries of what collecting means within museums. But yeah, we don't know yet where this is going to take us, I think.
Thank you. Yes, it's kind of an ongoing complex question, as also institutions change their inner processes and change at the level of infrastructure. So, but I wanted to at least put it on the table precisely because there are some interesting sort of examples or things that have taken place in recent years. We are approaching the end of our time, so I wanted to ask for those who are listening and watching whether there are any questions that they would like to share with Pablo and with Lisa Ratna. Please do not be shy. This is the time. We have, I believe, 10 minutes left before the end. And while I hope some people will write their questions in the chat, I also want to share with you my very last question. Again, our time, unfortunately, is very limited, but let's try to make the best of what we have. I wanted to really ask sort of the central question around which we've been sort of working our way through throughout the conversation, which is how to foster sovereign spaces. I want to ask you whether you think that such a process can take place inside institutions. If so, again, similarly to the conversation we've just been having around collective, what are your thoughts about some strategies and so on? And in the case of Lisa Ravna, I know that you, when talking about this question, you wanted to really, you've been underscoring the importance of notions of indigenizing rather than decolonizing. So I wanted to ask about this and also about your work and your experience with by the Collective project, but also for you, Pablo, in a similar but different way, when thinking about sort of this creation of sovereign spaces or strengthening of sovereign discourses. You mentioned that in your work now with Latinx and Mestizo practices, you were referring to the fact that some of these artists are using indigenous references and perspectives, right, to reclaim a certain sovereign agency. So I wanted to ask both of you to share your thoughts and potential processes around some of these questions.
Well, conscious of the time constraint, I'll try to answer very briefly. So I think that the process of decolonization is actually a process of deconstructing colonial ideologies and the privilege of Western thinking, which is essentially a process that is centered within the colonial structures that sort of perpetuate the existing conditions of art institutions or academia or insert whatever. Now, indigenization, on the other hand, is a process where the significance and application of indigenous knowledges is asserted into that institution or academia, but from a place of indigenous sovereignty. And when I say, and that leads up to this question about sovereignty, because I think we need to understand that sovereignty means different things in different contexts. So the concept of sovereignty is actually something that is very closely aligned to the notion of ownership, of feudal system, of like centering the power in the ruler or in the state. Now, sovereignty, for instance, in a Sami context, we have a term which is birget. Now, birget essentially means it is the verbal form of the practice that you engage in to create a good life. So, and when you have the maintenance of a good life, that is called birgejupmi. And that is to have a healthy relationship to your interpersonal relations, to the land, to the water, to the spirits, and to the practices, essentially. So sovereignty in a Sami context, in a very specific way, means to be in balance with the relations that make up the world you live in. That is sovereignty. And so inserting that into the institutions or into practices is really very difficult. So that goes back to the project that I've been working on now since 2021, where a group of Sami scholars, artists, and performance artists have essentially created this ongoing discursive performance where we interact with colonial stereotypes of the presentation of us as Sami, with really engaging in conversations, questioning and challenging these stereotypes through dialogue and through interacting with audiences. And yeah, very briefly, I'll also leave it to Pablo so that you have time to answer as well.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, I guess I would just say also briefly that my work with Latinx and Mestizo artists and communities comes from, I mean, from my lived experience, but lately from also spending a lot of time in LA and working on this Biennale for the Hammer has been also interesting because, yeah, as you said, there are multiple references to indigenous cultures within, Latinx artists that probably, are first or second generation in the US. So that has made me think also about what kind of connection is happening there. Is it a reference? Is it, in some cases might be even some kind of appropriation. In some cases, there is something that goes, that is happening in the practice of the artist that I would say kind of exceeds the artist itself. And that's been interesting to witness. I guess that this is a very delicate moment for all of this, and that's why at the beginning I was mentioning the importance of keep writing and keep producing knowledge within curatorial practice, and because impact there, I guess.
Thank you. I want to share with you this one question that came through the Q&A, which asks, can you think of one of the biggest ways you have had to challenge the institution?
Well, for me, it's not about the biggest ways of challenging the institution. It is about consistently challenging the institution, so that, you refuse to be silenced unless you want to be silenced, and that is another thing. But I refuse to be silenced. I refuse to sort of engage in this maneuvering of delicacies with institutions and people of authority, in the sense that whenever I go into a project, I will very clearly from the start say, look, these are my principles. This is what is important to me. This is my hill. I will die on it. Or I will, if you do not allow me to persist on that hill, then I will not work with you. Which means that, ironically enough, I do have a little black book, and in it is some names of institutions and people that I really don't feel comfortable working with in the future. Not naming anyone at all, but there is, I think it's really important, again, referencing what I was saying earlier about the privilege and authority, because I recognize that as that as an Indigenous scholar in the position that I have, I am very privileged. And so for me, it's very important that when I employ that privilege in the world, I don't do simply what I can to maintain that privilege for myself, but I actually try to use that privilege to open up spaces for other people. And if that is not happening within the institution that I am collaborating with, then perhaps I don't want to collaborate with that institution at that given time. Not to say that I won't do so in the future, but then things would need to change. And I don't really think that is expecting too much. I think it is something about shifting the understanding of what is the normative. And so we all deserve better. Every one of us, we deserve to have our space and our room and our time. And yeah, so the small everyday acts that you can do to challenge, I think, in the end, becomes the biggest way that you may challenge these institutions. Yeah. But thank you. That was a really good question.
Thank you. Pablo, on to you. Last.
Yeah, I totally agree with Lisa. I think that it's about trying to do our best to be some kind of like awkward presence, you know. Because yeah, I don't think that it's about antagonizing. And you know, the other thing is that institutions, we speak of institutions, but you know, the paradox is that institutions are made of people, and sometimes you find that in these institutions, wherever they are, there are people that is, you know, many times very thoughtful. Many of these people wants to do a good job, want to learn, and have good intentions, which is not good enough, of course. But the thing is that institutions become some kind of gestalt, like it's something that exceeds the people, right? Exceeds the people that is on it. Some kind of like almost kind of incorporeal machines, right? And that's something that you don't change with an action. That's something that requires presence and that requires, you know, yeah, strategy, but also I guess that as you said, Lisa, means also knowing what are, you know, what is the hill we are willing to die on, and what are like what are the things that we would definitely say no. And that's very important, I think. But then, like, yeah, I mean, we are working and we're also, you know, struggling in many cases, right? Because you know, I for me, I think that one way I try to see it is that I like to think that I somehow want to protect a space that also Aris had teach me this, like a space of creativity on my own practice, which is one of the first things that is sacrificed when you work for institutions and you need to repeat models. So thinking of the space for, you know, some kind of collective autonomy, I guess, within institutional practice is important.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you for taking the time to be so generous and transparent and caring. So I really appreciate it. Unfortunately, always time is never enough to really have in-depth conversations. We tried to do our best today, but thank you very much again for this. I know that I have to pass it on to Emma from AAMC when she has a few announcements.
Thank you, Ilaria and Pablo and Lisa for your time in putting this webinar together. I'm Emma, I'm the program manager at AAMC and AAMC Foundation, and just wanted to quickly step in to thank you all for attending today's webinar. It is our kickoff to the Art Curators Conference, and many of you who have tuned in today are attending either in person or virtually, and we're really looking forward to seeing you, you know, in person or online May 6th through 9th in New York City. This webinar has been recorded and will be accessible for all conference registrants if you would like to revisit it at a later date, or if you have colleagues that had to dip out for a meeting, you know, let them know that will be up. If you have any questions, you know how to get in touch with us, but we are really looking forward to seeing you all soon and appreciate all of your time today, our panelists, moderators, and all of our attendees. So have a great rest of your day, and we will see you soon. Bye.